Good late afternoon. Welcome to the Menil Collection. My name is Paul Davis. I'm curator of collections at the Menil, and this podium moves a little bit, so I won't lean too hard on it. If you could take a moment to just quickly silence your phones, I'd greatly appreciate it. And I'd like to begin this evening with just some quick thank yous. I'd like to thank the museum staff, especially Jeremy Falk, Lauren Gottlieb Miller, Natalie Dupéchet, Michelle White, Kelly Montana, Amanda Thomas, Nancy O'Connor, and anybody else who I've left out for all their support of this year's fellow, for all the work that they've gone and done to help. And also, I'd also like to recognize and thank Tony Martinez there in the back, who is sort of the silent partner and does a tremendous amount of work in preparing our programs and has done everything to prepare this evening's symposium. The Menil Collection is a vibrant, open space for the exhibition of work by innovative artists and diverse cultures. It is equally and importantly so a center for the critical study of and reflection about art and its disparate histories. These are two inseparable facets of the museum's mission. Since 2007, the Vivian L. Smith Foundation has generously supported the Menil's objectives by funding an academic year fellowship for outstanding doctoral candidates in the Department of Art History at the University of Texas, Austin. And I'd like to take a moment to thank the art history faculty at the university for their 12 years of partnership in making this fellowship such a significant success. The Vivian L. Smith Foundation provides fellows with a truly exceptional opportunity to engage the museum's collection and archival material while working full-time on completing their dissertations in residence at the Menil Collection. They also contribute to the museum's programming for its members and general public. The enduring scholarly impact of the Vivian L. Smith Fellowship at the Menil is resoundingly clear. Previous fellows have moved on to become professors and museum professionals at the Massachusetts College of Art and Design, the William Benton Museum of Art, the University of Texas El Paso, and the University of Texas El Paso. Last year's fellow, Jessamine Battario, who's here with us this evening, is currently the Mellon, I'm not bringing you back, even though I'd love to, is currently the Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow for Artistic and Scholarly Engagement and Programs at the Lunder Institute for American Art at Colby College. And so, before introducing this year's Vivian L. Smith Fellow, I have the immense pleasure to announce the 2019-2020 Academic Year Fellow will be Donato Loya, whose doctoral research explores the philosophical intersections of religion and secularism in art from the 20th century. So please join me in congratulating Donato. So I know I speak for the entire Menil staff when I describe this year's fellow, Douglas Cushing, as a wonderfully generous colleague and an astute historian of art. While in residence at the Menil, he has been incredibly active, giving talks to Menil staff, museum members, participating in national academic conferences, curating exhibitions such as listening to the Anthropocene at the Seraphim Gallery at Southwestern University, contributing essays to academic journals. He is the author of a fascinating short essay highlighting a contentious moment in the local Houston history, in which Cold War politics confront the radical ideas of the Surrealist magazine Transitions and the Menil support of James Johnson Sweeney's appointment as director of the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. His essay will be available publicly on the Menil's website on a read online section. So please do check that out. It's a really fascinating read. Douglas has assembled a fantastic program centered on the topic of his dissertation, namely the living histories and short-lived lives of the different Surrealist journals published during the early and mid-20th century. As the ideas contained in little magazines are wont to do, however, those ideas generated by this evening's distinguished speakers will take root, provoking and generating in all possible directions. Our present moment manifestly exhibits the need for this type of growth through constructive dialogue and critical reassessments of our shared histories. As illustrated by conversations during last year's program, the Vivian L. Smith Foundation Symposium is an ideal moment for these important perspectives about art and culture to germinate. I look forward to the new contributions Douglas and the scholars of Surrealism he has invited to the Menil will make this evening. So please welcome Douglas Cushing and let the revolution begin.
I would like to begin this evening, or this late afternoon as you suggest, with a few acknowledgements. First, I want to thank the Vivian L. Smith Foundation and the Menil Collection for their generous support. I wish to express my deep appreciation to our speakers tonight, Mary Ann Caws, Katharine Conley, and Laurie Cole, who have traveled from afar and sat in a while at LaGuardia in one case. Thanks to everyone at the Menil for all of your kindness. And I want to offer special thanks to Tony Martinez for all of his work in making this event happen. Thanks to Natalie Dupochet, Kelly Montana, and Michelle White for spending time with us this afternoon. That was wonderful. Also, my appreciation goes out to Natalie, Paul Davis, Lauren Gottlieb Miller, and Joseph Newland for our many conversations leading up to this event. Thanks to Joseph, Nancy O'Connor, and Amanda Thomas for your editing and design work. It's beautiful, isn't it? And finally, I'd like to thank all of you for coming this evening. What are modernist magazines? In introducing tonight's symposium, I wish to commence by explaining what little magazines are and why they deserve our attention. Here I thought I might begin with an anecdote about Yuki Desnos and her husband, the painter Leonard Sugaharu Fujita. I will use Yuki Desnos' full name throughout to distinguish from her later husband, the surrealist poet Robert Desnos. In her memoir, Les Confidences de Yuki, Yuki Desnos recounted how her former husband, the artist Fujita, had asked her to look for interesting reading material. She recalled that one day in November 1928, he placed a copy of the Parisian Surrealist's periodical, La Revue Surrealiste, on the table, asking how she had overlooked such a compelling publication. She had simply not seen the magazine in any of the Parisian bookstores that she frequented. That evening, Yuki Desnos asked Man Ray about the magazine, and he sent her to see Marcel Noël, director of the Galerie Surrealiste. Visiting the gallery the next day, she discovered 4 or 5 young people too absorbed by their magazines and other reading material to look up. Throughout the space were works by Jean Arp, Giorgio de Chirico, Max Ernst, André Masson, Jean Miro, Man Ray, and Yves Tanguy. Noel signed her up for her subscription to the Surrealist Little magazine, and he sold her back issues, as well as a full run of Littérature, the group's previous effort, spanning the shift from Dada to Surrealism. Yuki Desnos walked away with a veritable snapshot by the installment of the Surrealist collective evolving thoughts and efforts to date, save for the novels and Breton's Surrealist Manifesto published in the hiatus between titles. Such moments of discovery of and in little magazines are not unusual. These periodicals present an important, if under-considered, mode by which modernists broadcast their ideas. Broadcast, with its etymological origin in agriculture, in the wide dispersal of seeds is the appropriate word here. Little magazines sowed ideas. Readers cultivated them, and often they drifted from where they were cast, whipped about in the transatlantic winds. To offer an example from my own research, the transatlantic little magazine Transition, founded by Eugene and Mariah Gelas along with Eliot Paul, introduced the writer Inez Nin as well as the poet Charles Henry Ford to Surrealism. In the 1940s, Ford would edit the influential quasi-surrealist magazine View in New York. Both later met the surrealists themselves, but their first introduction was in a magazine. Studying little magazines is to track mobile ideas and relations. It is to pace the front line of a struggle against conventional tastes, mores, and politics. In few places can the heterogeneous international spirit of revolt be so acutely felt as in modernist little magazines, especially those of the historical avant-garde. But I've buried the lead. What are little magazines? The first English language monograph that set out to answer this question was Frederick Hoffman, Charles Allen, and Carolyn Ulrich's The Little Magazine, A History and Bibliography, published in 1947. In that volume, they explained, quote, "A little magazine is a magazine designed to print artistic work which, for reasons of commercial expediency, is not acceptable to the money-minded periodicals or presses," unquote. Or, as Ezra Pound put it in a 1930 article on the format, commercial magazine publishers had, quote, "failed lamentably and even offensively to maintain intellectual life," end quote. This prompted, he insisted, a need for, quote, "intellectual communication unconditioned by considerations as to whether a given idea or a given trend in art will get ads from the leading corset companies," end quote. We must soundly reject Pound's politics and prejudices, but on the subject of little magazines, his assessment is useful because it summarizes the complaints voiced by countless editors as justification for filling that artistic void with their own little magazines. And oh, was that void filled? Hoffman, Allen, and Ulrich estimated that some 600 English-language small periodicals emerged between 1912 and 1947 alone. Many lasted only a few issues, or even a single one, just enough to print the de rigueur manifesto or two. Little magazines were ephemeral. One reason for this is that being anti-commercial and experimental often meant financial instability, especially amid the Depression. And despite the relatively cheap paper and printing that made the periodical revolution possible, little magazines' advertising content tended to be in-kind exchanges and poorly paying spots for galleries, publishers, and other magazines. And in this case, this is an ad for the Surrealist Gallery in Transition, and they were getting reproductions of artworks in exchange for advertising for them. While some successful publications scraped by on subscriptions and sales alone, others required wealthy boosters. And scale is central here. What made little magazines little was not their physical format, but their circulation size. Unlike commercial magazines selling hundreds of thousands of copies or more, a periodical with a circulation of 4,000 copies, such as Transition, should be considered a big little magazine. Literature and Revolution Surrealist sold upwards of 1,500 and 1,000 copies, respectively. Experimental material also meant restricted distribution. Hence, Yuki Desnos not discovering the Surrealist magazine earlier in her travels. But don't let the small circulation and ephemerality of these publications fool you. Brian Eno's quip about the Velvet Underground's first album comes to mind, especially in front of the Warhol here. The record only sold about 50,000 copies in its first 5 years, he observed, but everyone who bought one started a band. Little magazines were similarly infectious. Introducing the periodical section of Gotham Bookmart's 1940 catalog, Story magazine editor Whit Burnett joked, quote, "Scratch an author and you will find a man who dreams of founding his own little magazine," end quote. Thanks to stores like Francis Stelloff's Gotham Bookmart, which made little magazines a specialty, select groups of zealous leaders awaited new issues of favorite periodicals as well as new titles. And if you read the memoirs that were written about it, they usually waited quite a while because almost every magazine that was promised came out late. In Paris, Sylvia Beach's Shakespeare and Company and Adrien Monier's La Maison des Amis de Livre played a symbol role. And in recovering hidden dimensions of modernism via little magazines, we must recognize that women such as Stelloff, Beach, and Monnier acted as essential tastemakers of modernism. Similarly, women helmed several notable little magazines, such as Margaret Anderson and Jane Heap's Little Review and Lise Darm's Le Fête de Nuit. Little magazines allowed modernists to place their radical ideas into circulation. Unlike the Surrealist cafe meetings, their scandalous manifestation, or their gallery exhibitions, which we know through photographic and documentary records or personal accounts, any one of us can pick up and peruse their magazines afresh today. Their covers will be worn with age, their spines cracked, yet little magazines preserve a raucous vitality. In magazines, the Surrealist aesthetics and Marxist politics, their visual and literary work coexisted in a single site. For me, these little magazines forge a multifaceted space that is at once part of the public sphere and subversive of mass culture. La Révolution Surrealist publication overlapped with some of the Surrealist short-lived real space experiments, such as the Bureau of Surrealist Research, open for 5 months in 1924 and 1925, and the Galerie Surrealiste, opened in 1926 and closed in 1928. And the Surrealist publications, Literature, La Révolution Surrealiste, and their successors, Surrealisme au service de la Révolution, spanned years of informal meetings at Café Certa, Le Petit Crillon, Serrano, and the Closerie de Lilas. Unlike these fixed locations, the Surrealist magazines were portable spaces dislocated from geography, foregrounding collective identity as much as the aura of the individual. In a sense, the Galerie Surrealiste might be thought of as a reified version of the ideal space that was already embodied by the group's magazines, functioning as a reading room, exhibition space, laboratory, meeting place, salon, office of a political front, and more. The Surrealists were able to project some of their complexity in the space of their magazines, and via publications sympathetic to their cause. With regards to modernism broadly, in little magazines, we discover an eclecticism largely distilled out of the story of history. As Suzanne Churchill and Adam McKeibel explained in their volume, Little Magazines and Modernism, quote, "The emphasis on collective groundbreaking that characterized little magazines in their heyday gave way to subsequent critical practices of strip mining, in which artists were extracted from their heterogeneous terrain, in which they were first published and singled out as the elite geniuses of modernism," end quote. That is to say, little magazines reveal the erasure that is endemic to the historical process of establishing the modernist canon. And to quote Churchill and McKeibel again, quote, "Little magazines draw attention not only to the binding force that drew disparate modernist writers and artists to collaborate, but also to the heterogeneity of their efforts, goals, and ideas," end quote. Put otherwise, in little magazines, we can discover the connective tissues of modernism and embrace the messiness and multivalence of history. My goal in bringing together these interdisciplinary scholars tonight is to welcome distinct yet interconnected perspectives on the roles surrealist little magazines and those periodicals responding to them played in promulgating and shaping modernism in Europe and the Americas. Under that aegis, we will hear tonight about numerous titles in terms of surrealism's transmission in and beyond Paris and its reception and transformation elsewhere in Europe and the Americas. We'll also consider the question of the ascendance of the surrealist object and their complex relation to the quote-unquote primitive or colonized other. By way of a final remark as prologue, I call attention to the preface to the first issue of Revolution Surrealiste, a paean to dreams by Jacques-André Boffard, Paul Herward, and Roger Vitrac, illustrated by Man Ray's Enigma of Isidore Ducasse. Ray's photograph of a sewing machine wrapped in cloth and bound is an homage to Ducasse, known as the Comte de l'Autrement, and to his famous simile, quote, as beautiful as the chance meeting on a dissecting table of a sewing machine and an umbrella, quote. The surrealists reveled in such chance juxtapositions and combinations. For them, chance prompted possibility of marvel, possibility of overthrowing convention. Therefore, in the interstitial spaces between all that is planned tonight, let us welcome fortuitous new relations, dialogues, dreams, the seeds of revolutions, and the marvelous where we find it. Thank you. So I'm delighted now to turn over the podium to our first speaker, the celebrated Mary Ann Caws. Before doing so, I want to just give a note about format. We'll have time for discussion at the end of the evening, so please hold on to your questions until all three of our speakers have presented. Mary Ann Caws is a distinguished professor emerita of comparative literature, English and French, and resident professor of the Graduate School at the City University of New York. She edited the HarperCollins World Reader and the Yale Anthology of 20th Century French Poetry, as well as several anthologies on surrealism. Her books include The Eye in Text, Essays on Perception, Mannerist to Modern, Reading Frames in Modern Fiction, The Inner Theater of Recent French Poetry, Robert Motherwell with Pen and Ink, with pen and brush, The Life and Work of Dora Maar, The Modern Art Cookbook, and Blaise Pascal, Miracles and Reason, as well as short biographies of Henry James, Virginia Woolf, Pablo Picasso, and Salvador Dali. Among Caws's recent work is her anthology entitled Milk Bowl of Feathers, Essential Surrealist Writings, published last year. She also has a volume forthcoming entitled Creative Gatherings, Meeting Places of Modernism. So what I'm saying is, you're extremely accomplished. Please welcome Mary Ann Caws.
Thank you. My first little magazine I edited my whole life, called Dada and Surrealism, was founded and funded by Dominique de Menil, and I'm just incredibly happy that I'm here to celebrate her also, and celebrate all of us. I'm just so excited to be here, and I thought that was beautiful, everything that Douglas said, and I want to say that the excitement to me of being here is just more than I can absolutely take in, which I'm glad about. So what I want you to see first, the disque vert. I'm going to show you first something that's, I think, funny, and it's called, thank you, the disque vert. And what this is you can park anywhere. Total freedom to park if you're driving a car that's ecologically wonderful. So I'm starting with the ecologically wonderful and the freedom that I feel this gives us all to talk about what we really want to talk about. You know that surrealism is about exchange and boundary crossing and all that kind of thing. and about dialogue and betweenness. So instead of talking about every slide as you're going to see it, I'm going to tell you first why I'm so immoderately excited about this whole thing. It's because it's very peculiar to talk about Belgium, about which I know almost nothing, to talk about the two various kinds of Belgian writing and thinking, violently different. So the North people and the other people and the Brussels people and the rural people are totally different. And so I'll be talking about what fascinates me, which is one tiny little magazine of 1924 to 25. So there are the big magazines and the little ones. We're only dealing with the little ones, and the little one I'm interested in is very, very small, and I'll talk about it and talk about the people who founded it. But I want to tell you first why I'm so interested in it. Because it's got these peculiar ways of looking at things. And Laurie Cole will be talking about questionnaires, and the first thing that I'm interested in this whole mishmash of this peculiar little magazine. This peculiar little magazine had 100 copies, that's it. And it was mailed out to friends, and it had almost no publicity, no anything, nobody knew about it. And it was called Correspondence, so it's about mail art. So what I want to tell you is why I found it so exciting. Why? It's because it has all these peculiar things. And about the questionnaire, first thing they did was to invent a questionnaire which didn't exist. So they answered a questionnaire that was nowhere, and it was taken from, they said, a magazine called Seven Arts. And the magazine called Seven Arts, very importantly, was anonymous. There were no signatures. And that's really what I want to address, and most of what I'm saying is the fact of having signatures or no signatures. And the reason the Brussels Surrealist people did not love the Parisian Surrealist people is that they thought that all of them, Breton and the others, were fame-seeking. They wanted to have their names. You know, they were less collective than they were individual. I have arguments with that, but that's what they thought. And what you'll be seeing is really their playing with the various famous authors like Gide and Proust and so forth, and they play with them, and I would say that they attack them, but I should say more properly they play with them, because they believe that it's more important to do what you do together. So I'm really talking about togetherness. And I think that you should know first that the Correspondance, the first issue, was 2 weeks before La Révolution Surréaliste. It was before everything. This is like at the very beginning, like who knew? And the title, of course, Correspondance, mail art, obviously, is interesting to me, and the fact that it was made up of different colored papers. And I'll show you some of those pictures. We won't dwell on what's in them. But the colored papers were all different, and they were signed by their individual names. But finally, they take leave. They say, well, you know what? We're taking leave. And that taking leave fascinates me, and I'll be ending with that, but not beginning only with that, because I wanted to talk about the freedom that you have to park anywhere and then to leave. You know, you can just leave. And the way that they take leave, these people, they take leave twice in the beginning and then at the end, and they say, you know, we're just taking leave. And I love the fact that they take leave formally. They aren't saying, you know, we're going to destroy the magazine. They just say, we're just taking leave. And the formality of it, I think, is important, because these people did not want to be all sort of like most of us dress, kind of like, you know, like poets. They want to dress up so that they could do the subversion that they were into from underneath. They compare themselves to termites, which I love deeply. And I think I should say, let me say first before you see the stuff, that the kind of thing they're doing, they take Gide's counterfeiters and they redo the Journal of Edward. You know, what? They take Poulin and his theories and they say, well, he worked on language. We're interested in the real. And you'll see repetition after repetition. It's all about fragmentation and repetition. So they say twice again something else, and then they say it again. No problem with them reading each other. It's as if they were each all together doing what they're doing. We can repeat, we can fragment. And that kind of freedom is really what I'm talking about here. They take Éluard's poems, they rephrase them, they recontextualize everything, they redo everything. And they take Breton's theories of automatic writing, they say absolute rubbish, it's not transparent, and so forth and so on. So the way that they are dealing with the real text is kind of fascinating and perhaps a little bit off-putting. There are only 21 of these, and then you're through. It's very tiny. The little magazine, it's a little magazine. It's really little. And what I love is Paul Nouget, the real intellectual. You'll see a lot of pictures of him. The real intellectual, strong-hitting person says, he calls it serpineuse. So whatever serpineuse means, I don't know, but I think about it like serpent, and it's kind of twisting and all that kind of thing. So besides the fakeness of that questionnaire that they make up, I love the fakeness, and I love the whole idea of pretending something, but pretending it formally, so they're not sort of doing sloppy pretending. I love the idea of the mail art, the ephemeral. As Douglas was saying, the ephemeral is incredibly important. And one of the worst attacks on one of their own members is that he dared, get this, to be in an anthology that was called L'Éternel. So what I love about the ephemeral is, of course, that many of our poet friends in France had a magazine called, a little mag, called L'Éphémère. And, ephemeral is, of course, on the other side of Éternel. So I like that, and I like a lot the way that they lead to situationism, because they are into disfiguration, détournement, appropriation, and plagiarism. Wonderful plagiarism. It's just fun. I'll give a wonderful example. Mallarmé, la chair est triste, hélas, et j'ai lu tous les livres. So they say, la chair est ce qu'elle est, et sans fin sont les livres. So they take this incredibly, Mallarmé like that, and they make it into a platitude, and the platitude is at once funny and subversive. It irritates you because you like a lot the sound of the Mallarmé. And the whole irritation thing was fascinating to me. I thought, how can I give a talk on something that's so irritating? Well, I'm loving it. I'm loving the fact it's a kind of like something that cares, if you spent your whole life, as I have, caring about poetry and the serious, and I can only translate sad love poems, and that's what I'm really good at, then to work on something that's kind of irritating is probably a good thing in my age, so that's what I'm doing. And you will see a lot of stuff that you will recognize, and I want to show you some slides soon, because what I'm really fond of course, is, naturally, the slides. So this is how I got into Belgian Surrealism. What in the hell, am I doing in Belgian Surrealism? Well, I was asked to write the introduction to these people of whom I knew zilch, like nothing. And I found it so fascinating. And one of the things that fascinated me, apart from the fact that it was fascinating, and I have a copy of it. These are little booklets that came out, so if you want to see them afterwards, there's one there. And I wrote the introduction. You can have a copy of that if they're enough. And it's so interesting to me that this man, Scutenaire, is one of the most interesting people you can ever imagine. Let me tell you why. Not only is he interesting to read, fantastic. So that's his wife, and guess who signed his books? His wife. Why not? So he wrote these novels and these books, and she would sign them. Not the one you just saw, but a lot of others. And nobody knew this until they were dead. Nobody could figure out why. Irène Amoir is her name. Why were these books coming out under her name? Well, she did a lot of correction, and as all us good wives do, we help our husbands write, and the dialogue between it is important. But then in their memoir, you're going to love this, the memoir that came out, they call each other she and he, no names. So it's kind of like this incredible dialogue that goes way past ordinary dialogue. So I'm very fond of talking about Scutenaire, and that's one of the reasons I accepted to do this peculiar thing. Okay, so here we are. These are the people who founded this magazine that I so love, called Correspondence. And you see on the left Paul Nouget, about whom I was talking, and I will be talking about him towards the end, because good things did not happen to him, except that he got taken in. So if terrible things happen to you, please hope that somebody will take you in. I'll tell you about that. So in the middle, you see Marcel Leconte, and I had to write him. We just did this dictionary of surrealism, and Kate Conley and everybody in the world is doing stuff on them, and I had to write on Marcel Leconte because I knew nothing about him, and I love mostly writing about things I know nothing about. That makes a lot of things I can write about. And here you have the facsimile, which you will see pictures of from facsimile, which is in the Watson Library of the Met Museum. Couldn't find any other copy anywhere. This is sort of interesting. In fact, it's very interesting. The Belgians themselves that turned into English Correspondence. And all I have to say about the translations is I'm going to read you one and you're going to see how interesting it is. It feels Belgian English. It feels Belgian English. And there, if you have a look at this book, and this exists, and you know, they talk about all the sheets that I'll be showing you. But it's really interesting to me that Belgians are the people who translated it. I didn't translate it. No, none of the people I know. And I think that it's wonderful that the Belgians are saying, hey, you know, we did something really terrific. Let's do more of it. So you might find that sometime. Okay, so this is the first page, and I won't dwell on all these pages, but what you will like at the end is that you're going to find that same phrase again and again. But can I see the phrase? Yes. When he says, puisqu'il est encore temps encore, permettez-nous de prendre congé. Sans doute reviendrons-nous ailleurs. And that, of course, is the term that Breton used finishing the manifesto, ailleurs. And that wherever in the world it's going to be elsewhere will come up again. And I think it's so interesting that he takes leave here. And number one, this is the first page. And then he's going to be taking leave again. That's what I mean about the peculiarity of this magazine. It's got repetitions, it's got fragmentation, it's got everything that you think of as being really surrealist. I won't show you all the pages, not to worry, but this is taking on Éluard. And it's kind of interesting to me that this pink, how do they decide who's going to be on pink, who's going to be on blue? That's sort of interesting, and I know not the answer to that, nor do the Belgians seem to know the answer to that. I love to have questions to which I'm never going to know the answers. This to me is serpineuse, whatever in the world that means, that I'm not going to know the answers. Ditto, that's the guy I had to write about. He probably has less personality than most people I've written about in my very long life, and that's wonderful, because then you know that you're really not being charmed off some topic. So I thought it was fun, and since it's fun encyclopedia, it had to be true, whatever that means. I love it. And that's Nouget. I mean, he's really most interesting. I can't read it. Nous nous aidons à inventer sur le réel deux, trois idées efficaces. The reason this is interesting is that he's taking up Poulin, who talks about inventing it on language. And they say, Poulin, oh no, language is too literary. We don't want any of this language stuff. Let's talk about the real. So that's kind of interesting that they are, and then will later be much into politics, and they say, oh, you know, the surrealists are just, you know, they're just kind of on language, and that's not really, that's poetic, but that's not where we want to be. Sometimes they change their mind about that, but I'll get to that, because to me that's incredibly interesting. Whatever you think of as real and whatever you think of as language, and since I've spent my life writing about language, to me language is as real as being with us all. That's what I live in. But the Brussels surrealists did not live in that. That's this again. Oh, so the reason I'm showing you this, Proust hadn't, all the volumes weren't out. So they took on Proust, the Search. They took that on way before the last volumes had come out. So it's a kind of peculiar rethinking of thinking about lost time. I find it interesting that the Belgians say we can't say anything about it, it's too peculiar. Yeah. I think it's sort of nice. And you see the elsewhere again. Here we are. That's again about the elsewhere. Ailleurs. So the word of ailleurs, you know, wherever else, comes up all the time, and I love that repetition. It's so very unwriterly-like. They were really, if I can put it that way, and I mean it as a compliment, they were unwriterly-like. They're unideal reader. They're everything you can imagine. So this one is important. This is an attack on the idea of transparency and in automatic language. And I should tell you, if I have time, do I have time to tell one brief anecdote? I tried to be a surrealist for a while in Paris, and I fell short every single time because they said that's not interesting enough. When you're writing automatic text, they're supposed to be interesting, and mine seemed boring. I love it. It's automatic, so it's... That's an anecdote that goes nowhere. Okay, so the point of this is they're taking on all these things that to us is so important, us Parisian surrealists. And I've spent my whole life writing on Parisian surrealism. So to me, to work on Belgian surrealism, I also do books with this wonderful young Belgian. We wrote a book called Undoing Art together, so we're doing a lot with Belgianism. This is the Elsewhere again. And that is, as I say, Gide being redone by them. And now there were two musicians who joined them, Roman and André Souris. André Souris is a wonderful writer, wonderful composer. And I like La Mort de Socrate because it reminds me of Eric Satie. La Mort de Socrate of Eric Satie is like Le Tombeau de Socrate. So they go on a little bit about Socrates, and I will spare you my Socrates reflection at the moment. But it's interesting to me that this is not in the Belgian. If you want to get the Belgian, the translation of everything, they don't have the music people. Don't know. And both those composers then, again, talk about the real. So we're into the real and not into language. Let me just say about this, which I think is very, very funny. This is a Dada. This is, a little bit later than the other one. So it's, as you see, 1 year later, and it's very Dada. It was Magritte, of whom you've heard, and Messens. If you say to anybody you're working on Belgian surrealism, they're going to say, oh yes, Magritte. Well, oh yes, not me, Magritte, except here I thought I should say I do know who he was. And this is the other side of it, and I'm showing you that because that's the back page of this one issue little mag. And guess what it reminds me of? Naturally, is the fountain, and of course, reminds me of God, since we're talking about God a lot. So this is the God of that wonderful Baroness and Morton Schomburg, and I just thought I should do it before we have supper or anything. Now, what I'm really interested in, what I'll be ending on, is the idea of group portraits. To me, the group portrait is incredibly exciting because it brings together a kind of collective that wasn't necessarily all in accord. I mean, these people were always not liking each other and so forth, and I can read you some of that, but it's kind of interesting. These were falling out with those, and it gets worse and worse. I love that because I think it's very funny. That's Mary Ann on the left, and you see Magritte and so forth, and they meet at Le Flower. So I just needed to show you that indeed I do know that this leads straight to situationism and the appropriation and the détournement and all that. That's how this little mag, that's how I got my title, of course, little mag leading to major stuff. And situationism, Guy Debord and all that, major. Okay, my favorite, the reason I'm putting this towards the end is everybody is there. Everybody didn't get along with anybody. I mean, every single person in there. The Jane Gavrol, who did that one, is the one who took in Paul Nouget. Because Paul Nouget, as I said, he ended badly. He took drugs, he took alcohol, he was crazy, he was suicidal. And Jane Gavrol, who is the photographer who did this, called La Goutte d'Eau, she had to take him in, and therefore his journal comes out of her house. I love it. So his journal, Paul Nouget, comes out of Jane Gavrol's house. And I'll say one more thing about that because it just strikes me as very wonderful. She then finally ended up married to Gaston Ferrière, and the psychoanalyst Gaston Ferrière was the psychoanalyst of both Antonin Artaud and Unike Zurn. And I met him once at Cerisier, and I couldn't believe it. It was just so weird that she ended up married to him. Is, you know, a little bit extraordinary. There he is, my hero, I guess, my temporary hero. Everything is very temporary. And that's what I'm ending on, almost. Now, the reason I'm ending on this, almost, is that it goes back to Brussels. Sorry. The first of it was in Paris and Brussels. Now, le disque vert, the thing that gives you freedom to park anywhere you want, like you can park here or there, is precisely this magazine. And I'm showing you the table of contents, which I hope will astonish you. Guess who's in there? Jean Cocteau. So Jean Cocteau was so loathed, not just by everybody, but so loathed by the Belgian surrealists, never mind he was an interesting poet, pretty good filmmaker. He was so loathed by them that one of their members, Christian d'Autremont, who founded Cobra magazine, did a eulogy of Jean Cocteau and therefore was banished for the rest of his life. He had to change his name. He then published as Christian Witz. So I thought, gee, this is pretty interesting. And the kind of letting go of the name seems to me important, and I think that's what I want to end on, quoting Scutenaire, the person you saw in the little Belgian thing. He said, "What's a signature? Belongs everything to everyone, not to everybody." So I'm leave-taking with that.
Just click on there.
Thank you very much for that talk, Mary Ann. That was wonderful. Our next very distinguished speaker is Katharine Conley. Conley is professor of French and Francophone literature and the dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at William and Mary. Conley's articles and books on the Surrealist movement include Automatic Woman, The Representation of Woman in Surrealism, Robert Desnos, Surrealism in the Marvelous and Everyday Life, and Surrealist Ghostliness. Her recent work is on Surrealist collections, including the article Collecting Ghostly Things, André Breton and Joseph Cornell, published in Modernism/Modernity, and Value and Hidden Cost in André Breton's Surrealist Collection, published in a special issue of South Central Review, co-edited with Martine Attal. Please help me welcome Katharine Conley.
Mary Ann, you're a tough act to follow. The preface to the inaugural issue of the flagship journal, La Révolution Surréaliste, and you've seen a better reproduction of it from Douglas than this, but it's the best I could do with my scanner at home. Published on December 1st, 1924, sets the stage for the importance objects would hold in the movement's unfolding. Published 6 weeks after André Breton's Manifesto of Surrealism appeared as a short preface to his first solo effort at automatic writing, Soluble Fish, the preface to this first issue of La Révolution Surréaliste visually assigns primary role to the photographed object at the center of the first page. Entitled The Enigma of Isidore Ducasse, the object by Man Ray, presented in a photograph also by him, constitutes a humorous response to the subversive aesthetic admired by the Surrealists, taken from Ducasse's Songs of Maldoror, published under the pseudonym The Count of Lautréamont, quote, beautiful as the chance encounter of a sewing machine and an umbrella on a dissecting table. Ray stages the female sewing machine by wrapping her in an old army blanket and string, in anticipation of her fateful meeting with the umbrella by chance, her rencontre fortuite, a concept canonized by the Surrealists as of supreme importance in all relationships, between human beings and between humans and objects. Both Lautréamont's non-traditional celebration of beauty, as exemplified by ordinary, practical things, and Man Ray's depiction of this aesthetic established the Surrealists in their first journal as purveyors of a new kind of art. Quote, all are whispers, coincidences, silence, and spark that ravish their own revelation. This sentence at the bottom of the first page, it's kind of underlined on the bottom. I won't point at it because I'll make a mistake with the slides. This sentence at the bottom of the first page of the preface by the co-authors Jacques-André Boisfort, the photographer, and Paul Éluard and Roger Vitrac, poets, grounds the image by Man Ray with an evocation of the group experience with automatism conducted in Breton's apartment in 1922 and 23, recreated in one of the photomontages on the cover of the first issue, again by Man Ray. Text and image together present an aesthetic link to objects that will become essential to surrealist collections as well, which is confirmed on the following page with the definition of surrealist facts. It's the first sentence at the top, in a way that highlights the integral role objects would play in the movement. Quote, every discovery that changes the nature, the destination of an object or a phenomenon constitutes a surrealist fact, they say. These two quotations crystallize surrealist theories of the object that would only be fully elaborated a decade later. The first, all are whispers, coincidences, silence, and spark that ravish their own revelation, conjures the atmosphere of the experiments with automatism that led the group of young men who gathered in Breton's apartment to choose the name Surrealism for the movement they were creating. Further, in The Mediums Enter from 1922, Breton qualified automatic experience as a kind of revelation. He explains how René Crevel initiated the group into automatic practice. Quote, so it was that in the conditions necessary for the production of such phenomena, darkness and silence in a room, a chain of hands across the table, he, Crevel, had soon fallen asleep and uttered words that were organized into a generally coherent discourse, end quote. The second quotation, identifying the founding vision of the surrealist object as a thing turned away from its original function, quote, every discovery that changes the nature, the destination of an object or phenomenon constitutes a surrealist fact, together with the evocation of the seance-like atmosphere generated by the group's nocturnal gatherings, set the stage for the importance of collecting for surrealism, with the collection constituting a privileged space filled with objects turned away from their original function, within which group revelations might more readily surge and spark. And this is a photograph of Simone Breton in the apartment where they met. Breton formally established the surrealist object as created by the action of turning it away from its original function in Crisis of the Object, published as an introduction to the May 1936 exhibition of objects in Paris. Here's some more photos of Man Ray of that exhibition. That original function wound up transformed into a ghostly latency in the surrealist object that gave it repressed energy, generative of surrealist activity and thought for those in close proximity to it. Such was the case for all the objects with which Breton surrounded himself in his Paris studio. One category in particular was inspiring to Breton: objects that had had a sacred function in their culture of origin, in particular from Oceania or the American South and Northwest. The role such objects had previously played in rituals in their native setting was of particular importance to him because of the ritualistic nature of the daily gatherings he organized for the Surrealist group, with the intention of provoking a secular, psychic type of revelation within themselves. Breton believed that proximity to the suppressed energies within his collection could assist in his quest for insight and access to psychic magic, because these things were alive to him as things destined to bring insight to the individual human and to bringing humans closer together. He and his fellow surrealists sought activities that would connect them to collective humanity, a connection inaccessible through their rational minds, daily activities, or regular social interactions. Objects that had played a unifying role in their original cultures through ritual could be particularly useful. All of the 5 photographed objects in the 12-issue run of La Révolution Surréaliste between 1924 and 1929 held deep personal meaning linked to community in their original roles. Ray's photograph of the Enigma of Isidore Ducasse, for example, had a powerful link to his childhood and his decision to become an artist. Having grown up the child of parents who worked in the garment district in Philadelphia and Brooklyn, Ray dismisses the tool of his parents' trade with this staged photograph, as though preparing it for storage. Its recognizable shape shows through the blanket in a way that reveals how persistent its ghostly former life remained for him. By only partially succeeding in hiding and burying its original purpose, Ray slyly signposts his own psychic journey in a surrealistic way. With his chosen title, Ray invokes Lautréamont's concept of the chance encounter as fated, as he lays claim to his own destiny as quintessentially surrealist on this first page of the Surrealist's first journal. He also embraces the surrealist anti-art aesthetic he had first encountered in New York through his collaborations with Marcel Duchamp and the New York Dada movement. By elevating the lowly sewing machine to the status of art while simultaneously displaying his personal psychic journey, Ray asserts his new role as an artist-creator in this new movement with this personal and iconic photograph. Beyond the Enigma of Isidore Ducasse, the 4 other photographed objects in La Révolution Surréaliste anticipate by 20 years Breton's essay on oceanic objects, published as a preface to a gallery exhibition in 1948. 2 out of the total of 5 photographed objects are oceanic, and a third, Man Ray's sculpture, which is in the middle on the top, was clearly created in homage to oceanic carving. The 2 actual oceanic objects include a Tatanwa mask from New Ireland and Papua New Guinea, published in the March 1926 issue, and a staged group of kava masks from the Binding people from the Gazelle Peninsula of East New Britain, also in Papua New Guinea, probably shot in an ethnographic museum and published in the June 1926 issue. The New Ireland Tatanwa mask was published in conjunction with the opening of the first post-World War I exhibition of oceanic objects in Paris at the Galerie Surrealiste that we heard about from Douglas, which ran for 10 days from late March to early April and included contemporary works by Man Ray. The mask is positioned in the midst of surrealist texts by Breton, quite possibly created in conditions involving whispers, coincidences, silence, and spark. The photograph of the binding kava masks is surrounded by a poem by Philippe Soupeau entitled, "Is It the Wind?" The photograph of Ray's sculpture, created in homage to the oceanic objects with which he shared his exhibition, just to go back to that for a minute, was published in the December 1926 issue, surrounded by a chronicle questioning the role of religion in society by Georges Rimond de Seigne. The last photographed object in the Révolution Surréaliste is of a Hopi Katsina figure labeled simply New Mexico and published in the October 1927 issue. The Hopi figure is surrounded by automatic stories by Benjamin Perret, another founding member of the group. Each photographed object is positioned against quintessential surrealist texts in an intentional juxtaposition that binds the images of things with surrealist poetics and political positions embedded in their desire to redefine aesthetics as simultaneously global and everyday, extraordinary and ordinary, as a way of saying the extraordinary should be ordinary and vice versa. Together, these photographs of objects show a strong appreciation for oceanic things from the movement's beginning and link them to the work of the unconscious in which the Surrealists engaged in communal effort to gain insight into themselves and their community. These images, embedded within the journal's first pages, function like seeds that would flower later on. They anticipate what Breton declared in the preface to the 1948 Oceanic exhibition, that these things exerted seduction and fascination on him. They enthralled him, with each one having the same sparkle as the others, and sharing important qualities with American Indian art, like the Katsina figure also reproduced in the journal. These photographs anticipate the poems Breton wrote in the same year about some of these objects, including the impressive New Ireland warrior figure, Uli, that stood imperiously on his desk, but which he only acquired 16 years later in 1964. The photographed objects anticipate how both Oceanic and Hopi objects would be prominently featured by Breton in the introductory pages to his last great work from 1957, L'art magique, magic art. And I'm sorry, this is such a poor reproduction. The second photographed object in La Révolution Surréaliste, a black and white image of a New Ireland Tatanwa mask from the March 1926 issue, would originally have been created for use and reuse in mortuary ceremonies known as Mulligan, a term which refers at once to the various kinds of masks used in the ceremony, to the ceremonies themselves, or to both mask and ceremony, and there are examples here at the Menil. Labeled only mask, New Mecklenburg, it was most likely acquired prior to 1914, when New Ireland was still under German administration. Masks like this are crafted for the traditional dance known as the line of Tatanwa and reserved for men. Often performed months after the death commemorated, since the food for the festivities needed to be planted, grown, and harvested beforehand, the mask worn for the ceremony is designed to imitate a traditional hairstyle worn by young men. The colors traditionally used, black, white, red, and yellow, not visible in the black and white photograph, communicate an association between men and magic through the manipulation of power and warfare magic and sorcery. The bird-like crest could also refer to the way New Ireland clans are categorized according to the birds with which they identify, such as hawks and eagles. The men involved in the line of Tatanwa begin the day by bespelling the masks with drops of seawater at dawn to make them new as the day is new. And then, once the mask is lowered over a man's head, as Brenda Clay explains, he must not utter a sound, for he has gone inside a Mulligan. This transformation of a man into a living Mulligan for the duration of the ritual dance, in an intentional suspension of his waking conscious identity, responds to what Louise Lincoln identifies as an overwhelming motivation to depict transformation, reversal, and ambiguity in Mulligan ritual, which contributed to the qualities that attracted Surrealist artists to New Ireland sculpture. This focus on transformation, rooted in a ritual designed to build community, would have appealed to the Surrealists, since they too hoped that their group efforts might yield a form of invisible potency of the sort generated by the traditional dances like Line of Tatanwa. Louis Aragon confirms this in his description of how the group's activities made him feel, as though, quote, in the grip of a tremendous momentum, we spent more and more time on the practices which led us into our strange inner lands, end quote. Later, in the same text, A Wave of Dreams, Aragon's version of a Surrealist manifesto, he defines surreality as, quote, the shared horizon of religion, magic, poetry, dreaming, madness, and intoxication, end quote. The published image of the Tatanwa mask, next to Surrealist texts, highlights the Surrealist desire to transcend individual isolation in a common quest for greater understanding of human psychic potential that they hoped would transcend geographic, national, and cultural boundaries. The binding kavat masks in their staged museum setting, the third photographed objects in the Surrealist Revolution from the June 1926 issue, would have been created for limited use. mainly for ceremonies involving masked men dashing through fires to mark the initiation of young men into the adult community, new births, or harvests. Made from bark cloth, bamboo, and leaves, they are not reused like Tatanwa masks, but destroyed or sold after use. They're predominantly associated with the natural world at night, a world of spirits and animals. There's a binding mask on the upper right in the Surrealist exhibition of objects from 1936, and there's one here in the Menil. Breton may have been aware of this, since he surrounded the photograph with Soupeau's poem, Is It the Wind?, which begins with an evocation of a nocturnal wind that shakes and sings. Soupeau is the poet with whom Breton co-wrote the first automatic text important for Surrealism, The Magnetic Fields, the composition of which Breton describes in detail in the Surrealist Manifesto. These particular masks resemble examples that have been identified as representing leaf spirits with an emphasis on the eyes. The persistent use of large eyes in the sacred sculptural objects of the oceanic islands has to do with the capacity of seeing, according to Nut Rio, in his study of sculptures from Vanuatu, an oceanic island south of New Britain. Such emphasis on seeing would have been particularly appealing to the Surrealists because of their focus on inner sight through automatism as well as on outer sight based on their ability to see the objects they arranged around them physically in the spaces they worked and lived in that constituted their personal collections. As Breton states in the second installment of Surrealism in Painting, published in the same March 26 issue as the Tatanwa mask, quote, I believe that men will long feel the need to return to its true source, the magical river that flows from their eyes, bathing in the same light and the same hallucinatory shadow, those things that are and are not. Here he highlights the importance of balancing inner and outer sight. The last photographed object in the Révolution Surréaliste was of a Hopi Katsina figure labeled simply New Mexico and published in the October 1927 issue. Like the Tatanwa and Kava masks, this figure was also created for use in ritual dances performed by Hopi Native Americans, designed to bring rain and plentiful harvests. Afterwards, it would have been donated to children as part of their spiritual education, and in some cases sold to tourists, like Breton, who bought several during his visit to the Hopi Reservation in August 1945. Breton hung his collection of Katsina in his Paris apartment as a reminder of the way the figures were hung on the walls of the Hopi dwellings he visited on his trip. His admiration was long-standing for these figures and their magical powers. 4 months before he published this photograph, and 18 years before his trip to Arizona, Breton had accompanied Éluard on a buying trip during which they found Katsina figures, which may have resulted in the purchase of this one. Breton confirmed in his 1960 radio interview that one of his greatest and oldest desires had been to visit the Indian pueblos. By then, he was taking notes for a book on the Hopi that he never published. What is left of his collection is displayed as Breton's wall at the Pompidou Center, and I don't see any Katsinas there. When Breton was transported by limousine from his house in the south of France to the hospital in Paris, where he died in September 1966, he was accompanied by Croatian poet Radovan Ivzic, who took note of what may have been Breton's last words, uttered during a break in the drive. What are the real dimensions of l'autre amant? Breton asked rhetorically. With this question, Breton summed up a lifetime of reflection on chance, surprise, desire, and aesthetics linked to objects. Clearly referring back to the ordinary objects l'autre amant repurposed as paragons of beauty in the songs of Maldoror, like the sewing machine, the umbrella, and the dissecting table, in a way that Breton wholeheartedly embraced and within which he lived his whole life. Ivzic vividly describes Breton's apartment when he visited it for the first time in 1954, quote, "From one thing to the next, the forces contained within these objects are awakened. The exchange of tremors and echoes between them are palpable and multiplied by their proximity to one another. Everything breathes in sync in a great welcoming calm. Ivzich's description of the objects in Breton's apartment as exchanging tremors and echoes in 1954 echo the whispers generative of sparks of revelation from the preface to the first issue of La Révolution Surréaliste, published 30 years earlier in 1924. Breton's collection of objects that had once had ceremonial use persisted in inspiring awe. That a small selection of such objects, similar to those owned by Breton, were enshrined in the first photographs of things in the first Surrealist journal is symbolic of the enduring importance they would have for the movement. Objects from Oceania were always of particular importance to Breton, going back to his first purchase of a statuette from Easter Ireland with prize money he won in high school, a sculpture he later reproduced in Nadja, along with the conical sulka mask from New Britain. There's a similar one in the witnesses' room here. In his 1948 essay, Oceania, Breton describes how these things inspired in him a compelling need to possess them so that he could learn about their past lives in order to understand his own more fully in its many dimensions. The objects staged and presented in this first journal belong with all the things with which the Surrealists shared their world and identified as having secrets to communicate to them, from whose ghostly emanation they and we may continue to seek revelation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. That was wonderful. It's a sticky one.
Okay.
There we go.
Go ahead. Just go to the little window down there. You go.
Thank you. Our final accomplished scholar for the evening is Laurie Cole. Cole is Clinical Associate Professor and Associate Director of the Interdisciplinary Master's Program, XE, Experimental Humanities and Social Engagement at New York University. Previous to her posts at NYU, Cole taught and lectured at Brandeis University, the Whitney Museum of Art, and the Museum of Modern Art, New York. She has published in Art Forum, Cabinet, Journal of Surrealism in the Americas, and the Oxford Critical and Cultural History of Modernist magazines. Her book, published last year, is entitled Surveying the Avant-Garde, Questions in Modernism, Art, and the Americas in Transatlantic magazines. I'm delighted to present Laurie Cole.
I want to thank Douglas for inviting me to speak, thank Tony for all of his work on this symposium, and thank everyone at the Menil for so warmly welcoming us, and thank my fellow panelists and all of you for being here. So my talk will focus on how surrealism was presented and reimagined in a selection of magazines across the Americas. In 1928, the Cuban magazine Revista de Avance issued a questionnaire asking, what should American art be? What should the attitude of American artists toward European art be? Revista de Avance, like many magazines of the era, sought to distinguish American art, or arte americano, from that of North America and Europe. However, two of the respondents, the Cuban artists Carlos Enriquez and Eduardo Abela, wrote in from New York and Paris, respectively, drawing attention to the fluidity with which artists and ideas circulated between North America, Latin America, and Europe, including movements like Surrealism. In fact, in his response, Enriquez claims that Surrealism belongs to what he called a common language of the true artist, suggesting that Surrealism could be imagined both as a shared repository of artistic strategies and also distinctly Latin American, namely part of what American art should be. Today, I will look more closely at how artists, writers, and editors addressed this tension between surrealism and American art, particularly through their contributions to magazines. I will begin by introducing the genre of the questionnaire, or enquête, which you've seen a few examples of tonight, to demonstrate how surveys such as "What should American art be?" emerged out of a larger field of inquiries issued by magazines, including many surrealist publications. Focusing on magazines allows us to turn to the artists and writers themselves to see how they narrated their own aesthetic and political affiliations. Magazines create networks that enable transnational collaboration, and they served as key sites for the dissemination and exchange of surrealist writings and artwork, documenting the movement's reach in places like Egypt, Martinique, and China. Periodicals also facilitated the circulation of surrealism in conversation with art of the Americas, showcasing the movement's relationship to local political and aesthetic platforms. I will consider in particular how surrealism was presented in the examples of the Peruvian magazine Amauta and the Chilean periodical Leitmotiv. Amauta engaged with the political valence of surrealism and showcased Peruvian surrealist writings and artwork, while the editors of Leitmotiv mounted several exhibitions of surrealist art, demonstrating how periodicals function in relation to other sites of cultural production. I will conclude by looking at how magazines in the 1940s, such as VVV, reflected the shifting status of both surrealism and art of the Americas. At once showcasing the international movement and inventing new local iterations of it, these magazines offer different approaches to reimagining both what surrealism and American art could be. The questionnaire, "What should American art be?" was one of many issued in the 1920s and 30s, part of a trend beginning in the late 19th century and continuing through today. Also known as surveys, symposia, or inquiries, questionnaires on a range of topics, and here you see ones issued on specific media, such as painting, writing, and photography, or on political issues like art's relationship to social concerns, race and representation, and nationalism, were posed by magazine editors to their contributors, whose responses were then compiled and published in subsequent issues of the magazine. The genre was so common in the early 20th century that one French writer referred to enquêtomanie, or questionnaire mania. Surrealist magazines were among the countless others that issued these broad, open-ended questions. Theirs included, "Why do you write?" "What was the most important encounter of your life?" And "What sort of hope do you place on love?" Such questionnaires worked in tandem with the movement's manifestos to articulate surrealism's aims in print. However, unlike a manifesto, typically a forward-looking document written in a unified voice, the questionnaire is often retroactive and produces a patchwork of responses, offering a composite portrait of a community, as you can visualize in the case of Minotaur. The surrealists playfully subverted the genre even as they took it seriously as a means of self-assessment. This one, for example, "What was the most important encounter of your life?" To what extent does or did this encounter give you the impression of chance, of necessity? Reinforces the surrealist interest in chance encounters and the role of the subconscious in aesthetics. Much as in the case of the Central Bureau for Surrealist Research, questionnaires allowed the surrealists to usurp the tools of social science for artistic ends. And I like how some of these images have circulated through our presentations. Because they circulate in magazines, questionnaires also allow us to trace the map of surrealism as it unfolded internationally, which pointed to a shifting world order, as playfully anticipated in the Surrealist Map of the World, first printed in the Belgian periodical Vacaïtes in 1929, which features Mexico and Peru and eliminates the United States except for Alaska and Hawaii. In 1928, a French magazine issued a survey asking if Paris was still, quote, "the world center for art." Such anxieties also surfaced in a questionnaire issued by the American expatriate magazine Transition. Known for introducing English-speaking audiences to translations of work by Surrealist writers such as Breton and Éluard, and artists such as Miro and Hans Arp, whose covers you see here, it also issued a questionnaire in 1928 to its European contributors asking, how, in your opinion, are the influences of the United States manifesting themselves upon Europe and in Europe? To which Benjamin Péret, the Surrealist poet and editor, responds that the influence of the United States manifests itself upon Europe, quote, through the most emphatic garbage, the ignoble sense of money, the indigence of ideas, the savage hypocrisy in morals, and altogether through a loathsome swinishness pushed to the point of paroxysm. Still many Europeans' views of the United States. Many of the other responses, like that of the Dadaist Tristan Tzara and the artist Theo van Doesburg, reiterated this sense of outrage, suggesting that the European avant-garde viewed the ascendancy of American influence abroad with great disdain. While the Surrealists scoffed at North American culture, they had a more complicated relationship with Latin America. In 1931, European Surrealists received a questionnaire from the Paris-based Latin American magazine Iman, asking, how do you imagine Latin America? What will its position be in relation to Europe? The inverse of the questions issued by Revista de Avance 3 years earlier, Iman's survey demonstrates the persistence of anxieties about Europe's relationship to the Americas. In his response, the poet Philippe Soupeau declares, Europe is dying, slowly, stammering, drooling, boastful, and as a result of Europe's imminent decline, he argues Latin America should demand complete autonomy from it. Such responses reveal how Latin America served as an imaginative foil for European surrealists, and how magazines such as Iman received and reframed surrealist discourse. Iman was co-edited by Alejo Carpentier, who was an editor of Revista de Avance before fleeing Cuba for Paris, and by the Argentine writer Elvira de Alvear. De Alvear hosted salons at her home that included many surrealists and is said to be the first collector of Giacometti, having purchased Gazing Head in 1929. The magazine's title, Iman, which means magnet, paid tribute to Breton and Soupeau's Le Champ Magnétique and registered the hope that Iman would bring together the North and the South, a goal reflected by its selection of contributors, which included Kafka, Hans Arp, Vicente Huidobro, Jules Solar, Miguel Ángel Asturias, John Dos Passos, and Robert Desnos, among many others. Iman, like other Latin American magazines, demonstrated what it would look like to integrate Latin American and European cultural production, in many ways modeling the relationship between the two, which was the subject of so many anxious questionnaires. Thus, while European surrealists imagined Latin America, Latin American artists and writers were actively reflecting on and reinventing surrealism in the pages of their magazines. Responses to surrealism varied a great deal across Latin America, since individual countries had disparate experiences of colonialism, urbanism, and cultural development. And while I will focus on the examples of magazines from Peru and Chile, I want to note that these are mere selections. There are many other rich examples of the presence of surrealism in magazines from Argentina and Mexico, for instance, which offer different trajectories. I also want to emphasize that most Latin American magazines were concerned with asserting an autonomous art, as evidenced by the Revista de Avance survey. However, such a project was enacted in conversation with the International, and magazines serve as the primary records for the transmission and reception of movements like surrealism in Latin America. Surrealism was appealing for the revolutionary political language it supplied, as you will see through the Peruvian example, and for its invitation to radical new forms of art making, as evidenced by surrealist experiments in Chile. Amauta, which means wise man in Quechua, was first published in 1926, and its cover featured a woodcut of an indigenous figure by the Peruvian artist José Sabogal. The editor of Amauta, José Carlos Mariátegui, was a Marxist intellectual committed to the indigenous cause in Peru, and he celebrated surrealism for serving as what he called a protest of the spirit and for its condemnation of capitalism. In 1928, Amauta reprinted Le Monde's survey asking, do you believe in the existence of an art and literature expressive of the aspirations of the working class? and translated it into Spanish, including André Breton's reply, thereby transmitting the surrealist debate over art and politics to Peru. Amauta was by no means explicitly surrealist. Rather, it was interested in the revolutionary political language that surrealism offered, and it served as a site for debate over surrealist politics. For instance, in contrast to Mariátegui, César Vallejo, a Peruvian poet who lived in Paris from 1923 until his death in 1938, believed that the movement did not go far enough in its commitment to revolutionary politics. In 1930, Vallejo published an autopsy of surrealism, which concluded, "Right now, surrealism as a Marxist movement is a cadaver." Such language echoes the dissident surrealist tract of the same name, published in Paris 2 months earlier. Vallejo writes, "There is only one revolution, the proletarian, and the workers will make this revolution with action, not the intellectuals with their crisis of consciousness." Beyond such political debates, Amauta also served as a vehicle for Peruvian surrealist literary and artistic production. Xavier Abril's surrealist poem, for instance, published in Amauta in 1928, had been featured in an exhibition at the Casa de America Latina in Paris the previous year, alongside the work of the Peruvian visual artist Juan de Vescovi, which was also included in Amauta. Breton saw the exhibition and responded with a digressive poetic treatise, which was translated into Spanish in Amauta. Much like Abril, the Peruvian writer César Moro, who had participated in surrealist activities in Paris, where he lived from 1925 to 1933, published his poetry in Amauta. From Peru to worldwide surrealism, Moro proclaimed in 1934, as he worked to position surrealism as a visual strategy that could transcend national boundaries. Moro organized the first exhibition of surrealist art in Latin America in 1935, along with the Chilean artist Maria Valencia and the Peruvian writer Emilio Westphalen. The show was held at the Sala Alcedo in Lima and featured 5 Chilean artists. However, 38 of the 52 works were by Moro himself, including Pedestrian, which is featured on the cover of the catalog, a work which Moro also included in the International Exhibition of Surrealism that he helped organize in Mexico City 5 years later. Such exhibitions and their catalogs were often produced in fluid conversation with magazines, allowing debates over the politics of art to be featured alongside the artwork itself. For instance, while working on his exhibitions, Moro, along with Westphalen, launched the magazine El Uso de la Palabra in 1939, which included work by Manuel Alvarez Bravo, whose photographs were also featured in the Mexico City exhibition and catalog. Similarly, in the Chilean context, the editors of Mandragora and Leitmotif organized exhibitions that showcased Chilean surrealism alongside work from the international movement. Mandragora, or Mandrake, consisted of 7 issues published between 1938 and 1942. Although one of its editors, Braulio Arenas, reflected that the periodical, quote, came directly from surrealism, he felt that the group did not affiliate strongly enough with the movement and chose to start a more explicitly surrealist magazine, Leitmotif, in 1942. Its first issue included an automatic drawing by Arenas on the cover and a Spanish translation of Breton's Third Manifesto. Its second issue was more visually dynamic, featuring reproductions of paintings, prints, photographs, and collages by artists like Roberto Mata and Man Ray, whose work you see here on the top left, along with literary texts by Aimé Césaire, here on the top right, all notably artists from the Americas. The editors of Mandragora and Leitmotif also organized surrealist exhibitions that became increasingly international in scope. A 1941 exhibition held at the National Library of Chile featured objects, collages, and drawings made by 2 of Mandragora's editors, Braulio Arenas and Jorge Cáceres. Next, the group organized a surrealist soirée at the Rosenblatt Gallery in 1943, which it advertised in Leitmotif. Lastly, in November of 1948, Arenas and Cáceres organized the International Surrealist Exhibition at the Dédalo Gallery in Santiago. It featured 60 works by 30 artists from around the world, including Arenas, Mata, and other Chilean artists, as well as Dalí, Magritte, Hans Arp, Wilfredo Lam, Leonora Carrington, and many others. The show was notable for its radical installation, which included a darkened hallway filled with chairs and crisscrossed with string. At the end sat a nude masked mannequin donning a sign that said, "Please touch." Such exhibition design was drawn, no doubt, from Duchamp's labyrinth of string covering the 1942 First Papers of Surrealism show in New York. Elsewhere in the Chilean exhibition was a mannequin painted black with a poem by Breton written on it in white, reminiscent of the proliferation of mannequins at the International Surrealist Exhibition in Paris in 1938. For the editors, such exhibitions and their accompanying catalogs complemented the aims of their magazines, in this case, animating surrealism for a local audience. These Peruvian and Chilean magazines, as well as the exhibitions that emerged in conversation with them, presented local iterations of surrealism alongside work from the international movement. In turn, as European surrealists traveled and moved abroad due to World War II, to Martinique, Mexico, New York, and elsewhere in the Americas, this move was registered in the magazines they produced in the 1940s. For example, here you see Dine, based in Mexico City, and the New York-based surrealist publications View and VVV, all featuring work by artists from the Americas. Magazines such as Dine and View also issued questionnaires, including questions like, what is the disappearing point of the unconscious? Thus revisiting some of the ideas that informed surrealism in a new context. Questionnaires were also issued by journals in the Americas, such as the Argentine Letra y Linea, directed by Aldo Pellegrini, which was among several of Argentine magazines that he was involved with, were published in the ensuing decades for which surrealism was a point of departure. By studying such periodicals, we can determine how surrealism was transported and transformed through print culture. One way that surrealism adapted to a shifting world order and to its own move abroad was by reaching out to new potential members from beyond Europe. For instance, VVV, begun by Breton and Max Ernst and edited by David Hare in New York between 1942 and 1944, was committed to publishing Latin American writers and artists. Benjamin Perret wrote to the Guatemalan novelist Miguel Ángel Asturias in 1942 to say that VVV would, quote, set up a network of correspondence throughout the Americas which will inform the public about everything that is happening in their respective countries, in the realm of poetry, art, philosophy, or any other realm that seems to them essential. And indeed, the magazine showcased work from Peru and Chile. Here you see a section in VVV titled Two Young Peruvian Poets, referring to Juan Rios and Xavier Abril, whose work is published in Spanish. VVV also printed a letter from Chile, from Arenas to Breton, including a timeline of the Chilean group's surrealist activities. Arenas, in turn, advertised VVV in leitmotif and featured work by Perret, Breton, and Mata, the last of whom served as a link between the two publications. The Americas had long loomed in the European surrealist imaginary. Conversely, Latin American artists and writers were responding to the movement, but ultimately forging their own artistic and political platforms. For instance, Carpentier, who worked on both Revista de Avance and Iman, returned to Havana in 1939, and in 1949 wrote the groundbreaking essay on the marvelous real in America, as the preface to his novel, The Kingdom of This World. He later notes that although surrealism originated in France, quote, in America, surrealism turns out to be quotidian, current, habitual. It beats and breathes in the heart of the home, in the simplest flowering of a mushroom. Carpentier's work demonstrates the reciprocal influence of Europe in the Americas, a relationship that was interrogated by questionnaires like those issued in Iman and Revista de Avance. Such magazines served as forums for the art, writing, and exhibitions that were at once internationally resonant, that is, part of a common language of the true artist. And also they present work that is uniquely Latin American, adapting the movement to create new institutions, audiences, and visions for surrealism, at once reimagining both surrealism and art in the Americas. Thank you.
Do you want?
Thank you very much for all three of those wonderful papers. I wanted to begin by asking a question of you before I open up to the audience and ask like a hard and broad question at this point. And that's, nearly 100 years on from the advent of surrealism. In this particular moment in history, why do you think it's still important to study it, to teach it, to consider it, to think about it? What does it have to teach us, and what's useful about it now?
One answer is that I think our papers demonstrate the extent to which surrealism really introduced a global aesthetic that wasn't linked to a particular country, but really had the very big ambition to be a worldwide movement.
Yeah, the whole idea of exchange and energy. To me, it's the most energizing movement I've ever even heard of. And I think we need a lot of energy now to put up with what we put up with, without going into detail about that.
I mean, the short answer is there's more to learn from it. And I think even in all our presentations point to new avenues of research, and particularly, as Kate suggests, in the kind of global reach and expanse, which I think is something that these Latin American artists and writers, for instance, felt a great tension and contradiction about the European origins of the movement, but that I think it's we're wrestling with its legacy.
Do you think there's an issue in the fact that there's that globalism, there's that potential within it, and yet one of the things that's always wrestled with in surrealism is the fact that it's always trying to tear itself away from Breton.
Yeah.
That he remains the center of it through either historical work that we do or through his own inserting himself into half the magazines out there in one shape or another.
It's fascinating. That's why I'm so interested in Belgium when somebody doesn't say to me, Magritte.
I will say the way he inserted himself into Amauta through his writing on Abril is he didn't read Spanish, so he read the poetry but didn't actually understand it. And so the text is just about Peru, this kind of digressive, poetic response to Peru as an idea. Mm-hmm. So I think his position is problematic, but opens up to new avenues, potentially.
And even though I have at times in the past argued against Breton being the central figure and really focused on the collective nature of surrealism, it always comes back to the fact that it's thanks to Breton that we know what we know. So he was the one that wrote everything down, that theorized in writing, and he was the pedagogue of surrealism. It's thanks to Breton that we know what we know. There was a rival group at one point that centered around Masson, and I was very interested in that group for a while, but Masson didn't write the way Breton did. So what they talked about, what they talked about is ephemeral. It's gone, it's lost. It's the writing.
It really is. It's that energizing quality in his writing, and I don't mean his poetry. I'm afraid that I really prefer the poetic prose to the poetry, but it's extraordinary. I mean, it grabs you. It grabs you. You like to be grabbed.
Thank you. Another question. One of the things I'm thinking about a lot, looking at the surrealist writing in their magazines and how it's carried elsewhere, is this question of the mythic. It comes up again and again when it comes to the Americas. It comes up certainly in View magazine. How much of that do you think is, well, let's put it this way. What are the dimensions of that first in terms of their collecting of quote-unquote primitive objects, and to what extent do we want to look at that and say that they are lending a mythology or trying to find a mythology they don't have in a way that exoticizes that other through that. And at the same time, how is that desire for new myths and myth making received in Latin America, a formerly colonized place? Yeah, it's an odd, big question.
I haven't thought of the myth in particular, but in terms of the colonizing impulse, I will say I've thought about that. And I'll be curious to hear your thoughts on this as well. But I think that as evidenced by the kinds of questions that are being asked and the kinds of responses being issued, there's this resistance to identifying with a European movement, or perhaps there's, in the case of the anthropophagist, a kind of playful cannibalizing of surrealism in European movements. So I like to think of it as a more complicated or layered response, but there was certainly, in the case of these Latin American artists, a search for their own origins in myth-making, and you can see Torres Garcia as an example of that, these kinds of thinking about pre-Columbian motifs and seeking their own origin story outside of this narrative. So I think in the kinds of case studies that I look at, they're doing both at once, responding to and reframing ideas received from Europe, often through magazines or through these intermediary figures, and also combating them with their own origin stories or myths.
To a certain extent, the European surrealists were also trying to reframe certain versions of history that they had grown up with. So they were very interested in alchemy and in medieval systems of belief that prefigured the Enlightenment, and in different kinds of healing. They were interested in folklore, folk stories, fairy tales as alternative ways of making sense. So they were trying to get away from dominant cultural narratives by finding alternatives in the past or in other countries.
Yeah, and that ritual thing that comes in so wonderfully. I mean, what you see here and what we saw in both your talks, the ritual, the carrying over of one ritual to another, that sort of impulse to carry, I think of it as the carrying over. You know, those of us who work on translation think a lot about carrying over one thing to another. And I do think that ritualizing of the mask and all that is fascinating. I mean, in Vancouver, you know, you love going up and seeing what Aube returned to the Vancouver people and to Victoria and all the ways in which the surrealists sort of merged with what they were giving back, the return of the mask. And that ritualistic giving, seems to me that's enormously surrealist. The gift, not just, you know, Robert Louis Hyde, but the gift of just plain giving. That kind of generosity seems to me typical of surrealism. Never mind the private quarrels and all that. And I wanted to say something I forgot to say, which is the purity thing, because the adoration of Schwitters by everybody, including even the Belgian surrealists, for the kind of non-monetary, I mean, the poorness, they feel this romanticism of this figure. And I find that the ritual carrying over of the figuring very, very beautiful. I mean, that is revelatory and beautiful. It's just beautiful. Yeah, it's beautiful.
We should probably open it up to questions from the audience.
I have a mic here.
It's not really a question. I'd just like to say thank you for mentioning the Belgians, because it's like they're reaching out across this vast span, you know, this blue ocean, to reach out to us. And I don't think it's so much as like that you're trying to create, it's like you're saying, the passing on of the ritual. We're not trying to create something, we're just trying to identify what's already there with the gesture, you know, with the passing of a torch, however you like to accept it. But I think it's really interesting, the dichotomy too, because as it's passed on in Latin America, say you want to, you know, give us a hand at expressing that we understand, you know, essentially that we're trying to understand. But then you have the adverse in Europe, the people that wouldn't sign their names or weren't worried about the permanence of life, but the impermanence. So I think that's kind of like full circle. Thank you for mentioning it.
The reaching out is very important.
Thank you for all the papers and your careful work. Excuse me. I was interested in the mention of Aimé Césaire and whether you could elaborate a little bit more on the kind of crossover between the Négritude movement of Aimé Césaire and the Surrealists. I know that they often also staged kind of explicitly anti-colonial actions.
So that is a whole nother talk, but just to address that in brief, and thank you for that question. So there's a really interesting group of Martinican students who are living in Paris who in 1932 published a manifesto called Légitime Défense, after Breton's manifesto, that is really an anti-colonial treatise, but borrowing the terms of communism and surrealism to make the case for an anti-colonial movement. So that's really the foundation for their involvement with surrealism. So again, using kind of paradoxically the language of the oppressor, because it was this revolutionary political language and because the surrealists staged things like the 1931 anti-colonial exposition. And then in turn, the longer story is that Breton was in Martinique when he was fleeing France, and he describes encountering Aimé Césaire and Tropique, and then the two of them created all sorts of texts and literature that worked, I think, much like the magazines I talked about, both in conversation with each other and in tension. So, much longer question, but I'd be happy to talk more about it.
Thank you for those talks. I was struck by the images in all your talks that were full pages of the journals, and it struck me that the page of the journal is a kind of marriage or a meeting place between the surrealist analogy and exhibition space. So I wonder if you could talk about the relevance of that today, of how we can think curatorially about the ways in which juxtaposition or contraries or spatially the page of the magazine serves as a kind of an example.
Sorry, I'm just really excited about all these questions. Yes, I strongly agree. I think that's a wonderful observation, this idea of juxtaposition. And one of the things I love about studying these questionnaires is that the responses are really like a magazine in microcosm. It's just the juxtaposition of unlike contributors and their ideas alongside each other. And I think that's a wonderful curatorial gesture, and I do think that many of us who study magazines think of them as sites of display and spaces of display. And so that's why I think it's fitting that so many of these editors were themselves curators. And this is particularly true in Latin America because there were fewer institutions for showing, and in North America for showing modern art in the early 20th century. So Revista de Avance, for example, the editors mounted the first exhibition of avant-garde art in Havana, and then they reproduced the work in the pages of the magazine. So I do think that there's a wonderful alignment of this curatorial impulse with the impulse to produce a magazine, which then in turn circulated that artwork and that experience of the exhibition to a wider audience. But I know your objects also have that same kind of impulse.
The same kind of juxtaposition. Your question also makes me think of the example of Lee Miller's reporting on World War II in Vogue magazine. And if you look at the pages of Vogue magazine, in which her photographs of the London Blitz, and then her being one of the first photographers to enter the concentration camps and reproduce the photographs with text in Vogue magazine, is very surrealistic in the sense that there are these photographs and her description of what it was like to take the photographs alongside women's magazine advertisements, because Vogue magazine, of course, was a commercial magazine, and there are photographs of, I can't remember exactly, but advertisements for hats and fashion. It's this jarring juxtaposition that actually was quite surrealistic in a way, and underscored how unreal the nightmare world that she discovered as she was photographing the end of the war was.
Yeah, and you can see the difference when you see a picture of a magazine one half, you see the page without seeing the dialogue, and you feel gypped. It's fascinating when you compare the difference. And Breton did a lot of that, of course, comparing the one thing, but then the dialogue of the facing page. You're saying, always call the facing page en face.
I would add one more thing. I like how, Douglas, you had alluded to the material conditions of reading a magazine and how that is kind of a consistent experience across time, so that we have, in many ways, the same experience of reading it as its contemporaries. And so I do think that magazines themselves are, of course, curatorial objects, and I know it's a challenge to show them in museums, but I like that you brought our attention to that as well.
One other aspect of Surrealist magazines was that they didn't see the photographs of objects or of works of art as mere illustrations for the text. So the work of art, the photograph, for example, had, in some cases, co-equal status with the text. And that evolves from the 20s through the 30s. And that was another way in which they were revolutionary.
Absolutely. Although, one of the things that strikes me, and I've been thinking a lot about recently, is the sort of break between the first wave of the avant-garde and the second wave with surrealism, and the design of these magazines and how you're meant to read them. So you go back to something like Blast or Dada or any of those, and to read the magazine, you're turning it 15 ways and trying to look through, because the text is overlapping. The text is made to sometimes be illegible and unreadable. And the surrealists, for all their revolutionary verve, make very well-designed magazines, composed magazines. And when I think about some of their spaces are very composed too, very organized, until you get to something like Duchamp and Miles of String. But that's an imposition of a non-surrealist friend of the surrealists in a way, in conjunction, of course, with Breton. But a really interesting example of a gallery and magazine exchange in the United States is Little Review, where Jane Heap actually is trying to create and open and keep a gallery named after the magazine going, as she is taking over the magazine in the mid-20s or so. And Anderson is pretty much hands-off at that point. And she goes on to curate a large machine art show was it 1930? Yeah, around there. But yeah, and so for her, when you look at those late issues, a little review, the way art and text play has a certain...
27, sorry. I think it's 1927.
27,
yeah. It ends in 29.
Yeah.
And
oh, sorry, I said 30s, I mean 27. When you look at the later issues, there is that back and forth in terms of seeing how Jane Heap is thinking about space.
I also love that example because for the Machine Art Exposition, the magazine is the catalog for the show, so it's a wonderful confluence.
May I say an impolite thing about questionnaires? The most famous one is somebody asked, I won't even go into detail, but you imagine that I can, because we do a lot of this. So somebody says to Breton, so what does the woman prefer? And he says, why does that matter? This is a very famous questionnaire. It had to do with sex, obviously. And of course, why would anybody care? I mean, please. I think that's one of the funniest, unfunny things that keeps coming up all the time.
You'll also notice for the image, the Magritte collage for the Surrealist Questionnaire on Love, similarly problematic gender politics, visualized by the central nude figure and the men surrounding her. Yeah.
About the questionnaires, how broadly were those questions posed? Were they just by invitation to certain respondents?
We would sit around, like the collective, we're speaking of groups, meeting. So we're in this meeting, it's called a Surrealist game. And then this would be asked and everybody would respond. And of course, everybody knows what everybody responded because people would write it down.
Many were issued by magazine editors to their contributors, so they were not open to the public, although as a reader you might imagine what your response would be. But for most of the ones I looked at, you find letters in the archives of editors reaching out to every canonical artist and writer, and then whatever they got back they published, pretty much unedited.
Unediting is funny too.
You made a point at the beginning of how little these magazines are in terms of how few were published. So I'm wondering how we have them. Who would have saved them, and where did you find them?
That's a great question. So for example, Revista d'Avance, there's Langston Hughes's copy of it in the Beinecke at Yale. So you have these wonderful figures who kept the material. So I know Douglas and I have talked about how Eugene Jolas, the editor of Transition, asked for copies of Amauta, for example. And so these figures whose archives we have often include their magazines, at least in the case of the ones that I've studied.
Almost impossible to find. So please, if you have some rare thing, please give it to the Beinecke or to the Getty or wherever you want to give it, but don't just hoard it.
And for some of these, actually, some university libraries had subscriptions to these. Not a lot, but enough that you will find them in those collections and large library collections that held on to them. And nowadays, if you want to find them, usually you have to go and look at auctions or rare book stores to find them.
And we've been very fortunate that some publishers have published facsimile editions.
Yes.
And so those books are very well worn in my personal library.
We could probably do one more question. Anybody has one?
So I'm interested to know if these magazines were traded amongst each other, because I know it's popular in zine culture for a lot of trades to go on, so I was just curious about that.
Yes.
Yes.
Definitely. These
Great
were
question.
people were all friends with each other. When they traveled, they brought copies of their magazines, often to promote themselves and their work. So, Duchamp started The Blind Man to show Fountain. And so, yes, they happily exchanged work with each other and were deeply influenced by each other's magazines in many documented cases.
And quite often publishing in one another's magazines at the same time as editing their little magazine, which is another way in which they exchange. And so,
Yeah, that meeting place that you talk about. Yeah.
Yeah. So Jolas was published in Iman, for instance, and Carpentier in Transition.
Yeah.
yeah.
I think there was another question.
Yes.
Yes, Sandra had a question.
I don't have to ask a question, but I was wondering about sort of the history of working on little magazines, if, given their ephemeral nature and in consideration of Roberto's question about the curatorial parallels of the magazines. And I was thinking about Dada and Surrealism reviewed in 1978 at the Vogue Gallery, if any of you have worked on that, or sort of the revival of interest in the little magazines.
All I can say is bravo, there's a big interest. When I tried to sell Dada Surrealism, because, we founded it in 1983, and as I say, Dominique de Menil was very much alive, and I took it to a bookstore, Wittenborn in New York, and I said, well, I have this little magazine, and, do you think you would like to sell it? Though the word money, of course, never comes into this at all. No finance. Would you like to sell it? He said, I know somebody who would like to finance it, and that's how Dominique de Menil came into it. But had I not taken it, literally, what had been about to appear in it, I hoped, to Wittenborn, I wouldn't have met Gabriel Austin, who was a friend of Dominique. And, it's that exchange between friends that seems to me to be incredibly important in the exchange of little mags, more than big mags. 100 copies of Correspondence. I love that mail art starts with 100 copies, before you get to Ray Johnson even.
I would also add that I think because so many of these have been digitized in the past decade or so through efforts like the Modernist Journals Project, and also many European libraries have wonderful digital archives of their magazines, and it's enabled more scholars to study them. And what's interesting to me is that this is often disciplinary specific, so there's a lot of interest amongst literature scholars, a lot of interest among Latin American art historians, and amongst contemporary art historians, often it's 1960s or post-war magazines like Aspen or Avalanche, but I do see similarly this renewed interest, and so I'm hoping there can be some more cross-disciplinary conversations like these.
And the Met just last week celebrated its digital opening of the archive along with the one in Prague, so that was pretty exciting. So we all went and celebrated digitalization.
And also I'll just add a plug for the Amauta exhibition that is going to be coming to the Blanton next year. So more curatorial efforts like that as well will revive interest in the topic.
And Douglas's work.
And speaking about the history of it, so after that volume from 47 that I showed, there's not a lot out there other than people mentioning magazines here as they're writing a history of a particular movement. But then in, I want to say it's 77, Howardina Pindell actually writes a piece in Print Collector's paper that's about artist magazines, and most of what she talks about are little magazines, and actually does a bibliography of them and lists somehow when they're published, who's publishing, and all that. And that is sort of an interesting revival moment, and then they drop off again. And then they come back. I would say the 90s is when people start paying attention again, really, and up through really the present. As you said, digitization has made it a lot easier for people to study some of these objects that are very rare magazines. Very hard to find some of them. All right.
Great audience.